You definitely know about the dig since you're listening to this podcast, and you probably know about Jacobin, which helps put out the dig, but you might not know about Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy. Capitalism is once again up for debate. Catalyst, a journal of theory and strategy, is a scholarly journal produced by Jacobin Foundation that aims to do everything it can to promote and deepen this conversation. Its focus is, as the title suggests, to develop a theory and strategy with capitalism as its target, both in the North and in the global South. That's an ambitious agenda, but this is a time for thinking big. You can check out Catalyst's great essays, including contributions from scholars like Mike Davis, and subscribe in print for just $20 for an entire year by going to bit.ly/digcatalyst. That's bit.ly/digcatalyst. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. It's incredible and makes me feel incredibly old that Occupy Wall Street took off 10 years ago. It happened at a moment when no one thought that such a thing was possible. The left, after all, had been in a state of near irrelevancy for decades. The anti-globalization movement that began in the late 90s and the Iraq War movement had boomed and then fizzled. And even during those brief booms, the left's assumed posture and ambition was to dissent and oppose. The idea that the point is to win power and govern to transform society, such a commonplace premise on the left today, was not on the table. It was almost unimaginable. Occupy generated a ton of debate and criticism on the left at the time, and also in the years after. But looking back a decade, it's impossible to imagine the renewed U.S. left that we have today coming into existence without Occupy and the cycle of social movements that Occupy kicked off. And then, of course, the Bernie campaigns, which spoke Occupy's language of class war against the 1%.
Human bike is! And what the human bike is! Last week, we came to a consensus on a document called the Declaration of the Occupation of New York City. Our process is direct democracy.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, there are people demonstrating against Wall Street in New York City and other cities around the country, and I think the perception on the part of these demonstrators and millions of other Americans is that as a result of the greed, the recklessness, and the illegal behavior on Wall Street, we were plunged into this horrendous recession we're currently in. Do you agree with that assessment?
Today, I'm discussing Occupy, what happened then and its legacy, with Astra Taylor. Before we get started, this podcast is supported by listeners just like you. Well, listeners just like you and also publishers like Verso. But it is mainly supported by listeners just like you, supporting us at patreon.com/thedig. If you want to ensure that we, The Dig, exist for the long haul, please make a contribution. If that contribution is at least $10 a month, we will send you a book or books or a tote bag or mug in the mail. And whatever the size of your contribution, we'll send you a copy of our new weekly newsletter by email. Our new weekly newsletter is excellent. Take a minute to contribute now and receive our new email newsletter. That's patreon.com/thedig. I should also mention that this episode of The Dig was developed as part of a collective of podcasts brought together to explore the legacy of Occupy in light of the 10-year anniversary. Through this project, you can also hear analysis on the impact of Occupy from podcasts like Belabored and New Dawn. The producing partners for this project are the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation's New York office and the New School's Milano program. I encourage you to learn more and to listen to some of the other episodes by visiting rosalux.nyc/occupy. That's rosalux.nyc/occupy. Okay, here's Astra Taylor, a filmmaker, writer, and political organizer. She is co-founder of The Debt Collective, director of multiple documentaries including What is Democracy and You Are Not Alone, the author of books including Democracy May Not Exist But We'll Miss It When It's Gone, and most recently, Remake the World, Essays, Reflections, Rebellions. Astra is also, of course, a regular guest host here on The Dig. Astra Taylor, welcome back to The Dig as a guest.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
It's hard to know where to begin this interview about Occupy. It began on September 17th, 2011 in Zuccotti Park and ended on November 15th when the NYPD evicted protesters by force. So I guess let's start just by setting the scene. What is Zuccotti Park and what happened there on September 17th, 10 years ago?
Zuccotti Park is a little plaza a few blocks north from the iconic Charging Bull statue in Lower Manhattan, the statue that really symbolizes Wall Street. It's kind of an unassuming space. It's granite. There are these raised planters with some trees and some sort of benches, and its eastern side runs along Broadway. So in that sense, it's a highly visible plaza, and it kind of sloped downwards to the west side. So it almost had this sort of natural space where you could kind of stand, not quite on a stage, but a little bit elevated. The other important thing to note about Zuccotti Park is that it's not really a park. It wasn't a public park, because public parks in New York City close, I think at midnight. It was a kind of quasi-public park, a private-public partnership owned by Brookfield Properties. And because of this quirk of ownership, it was open 24 hours a day. So Zuccotti Park had been scoped out by part of the group that was planning Occupy Wall Street in New York City. I think it was like their third or fourth choice as a place for an encampment. But it ended up being the spot that we marched to that morning, or maybe it was the afternoon. I'm confused. Might have been late morning, early afternoon, that we walked north from the Trojan Bull statue. And I remember asking someone, where are we going? And they said, I don't know, Zucchini Park? And we walked a few blocks in a very kind of organized fashion. I think we chanted a bit, but it was pretty straightforward. And we flooded into Zuccotti Park. And basically within minutes, we sat down in these little groups, mini assemblies, and started talking about why we were there and what issues were impacting us. And this question of what was our one demand. And the plan was to occupy Wall Street. And what was amazing is that people did it. And they were there for 2 months until they were evicted by Mayor Bloomberg as part of a national crackdown on occupies across the country. And so that was how the morning began, as we marched up in a very orderly fashion to Zucchini Park.
Sociologist Ruth Milkman and co-authors wrote, quote, OWS was not a spontaneous movement that appeared out of nowhere. It was carefully planned by a group of experienced political activists, newly inspired by the Arab Spring and the surge of mass protest around the world in the first half of 2011. That may be true, but what Occupy became went well beyond anything that planners had imagined, and many people who became active participants didn't have much political experience at all, particularly as occupations spread beyond New York to cities all over the place. Meanwhile, most everyone on the left at the time, as far as I can recall, was absolutely shocked that Occupy took off and exploded the way that it did. What did Occupy seem like at the beginning? What did you make of it? And then what did it become?
I mean, the one thing is that it was planned. It had been planned for months by a group calling themselves the New York General Assembly. And this was a small, rotating group of a few dozen folks, if that. One of them was my good friend, David Graeber, the late and great anthropologist and writer who would really, kind of come into national prominence during Occupy Wall Street, which coincided with the publication of his book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, that was an international bestseller. And so it was planned. I mean, they had different working groups within this assembly. They focused on sort of media, communications. They came up with the slogan, "We are the 99%, the frame of the 99%. They actually decided in those meetings, which happened weekly in Tompkins Square Park, they decided not to have demands for strategic reasons. And we can get into that because I think they were right. And they had a tactical group. It was this group that had scouted Zuccotti Park and knew that it was there and had actually knew about its legal status. There was even a group of them that did a trial run where they tried to spend the night at the New York Stock Exchange, sleeping on the sidewalk. And the results were pretty bad. I think 9 people got arrested. So it wasn't very promising. So David Graeber, was very direct. I mean, he's said in interviews, I think he even said in the Milkman piece that you just referenced, I didn't think we'd make it through the night. I thought we'd get arrested. And that was what I thought as well, because I had spent the aughts in New York City protesting under the shadow of the war on terror, when, it just felt like you would, come into public space and be kettled. Like there was impossible to kind of get a critical mass. I mean, maybe you'd be shunted into a free speech pen. Gatherings of over 20 people were illegal. So, I mean, and this was not a group that was asking for a permit, right? So on the one hand, yes, this group was planning an occupation, but I don't think they thought they were going to make it through the night. It's also important to give the context. I mean, and you mentioned the Arab Spring. If we think of that as the beginning of Occupy, then things actually kick off in Tunisia in December of 2010, when a vegetable seller named Mohamed Bouazizi, he was being harassed by the police. And in protest, he immolated himself. And that energy was circulating around the globe. And so Occupy felt really linked to the game, Of course, there was also the financial crisis that it was responding to. And so there had been a call from Adbusters, the Canadian magazine, and it was about as minimal as you could get. The call was, Occupy Wall Street, September 17th, bring a tent, stay for months.
And there was a little dancer on top of the Wall Street Bull.
Yeah. And it said, it said 20,000 people. The people who were planning Occupy Wall Street were like, stay for months with 20,000 people. I mean, it was totally disconnected from reality on the ground. And so they set their own ambitions. They, set their own terms. I mean, September 17th was completely arbitrary. It was picked because it was the birthday of one of the editors of Adbusters' mother, right? Like, I mean, it was completely random. And the fact that it took off was a testament to the folks who were planning it, some of whom included people who were kind of online rabble-rousers and connected to Anonymous, which was another big social trend at the time. It was in a way the most vibrant political force in the United States, which I think is a real contrast to where we are now. So there were sort of people who were trying to organize and translate online discontent and rebelliousness into offline action, which is always difficult. And it just felt very improbable that it would take off. The other thing I'll say as context is that there were attempts in that period to mobilize movements against Wall Street. There had been a multi-week occupation called Bloombergville that was targeting the city budget and the mayor. That lasted a couple weeks, but definitely didn't grab national headlines. There had been a massive march in May of 2011. I went to it. I can't even remember it, but I know I went to it from emails, but it was so boring that I don't even have a memory of it. But it had lots of great demands. I mean, a huge number of people in comparison to those early days that Occupy showed up. And yet it didn't do anything, in terms of lighting a fire. So it was interesting. I don't know what it was about Occupy, but I'm sure that it had to do with the audacity of it and the fact people just stayed put.
To step back for a sec, what was it about the state of the left at that time, at the end of the aughts, that made Occupy's explosive growth so surprising to most of us who'd been on the left for a little bit?
Dan, this is where I have to also invoke my privilege as a DIG co-host, because I think you and I both really recall how barren the left was in those days, right? I mean, it was demoralized, beaten down, sidelined. It kind of reveled in its own powerlessness, right? I mean, there was, I'll never forget, and I wrote about this at the time. I wrote about it in essays, I wrote it in emails to friends, but what really struck me that first day at Occupy Wall Street, September 17th, even though there was probably only 400 people, I didn't know them all. I knew 10 of them, maybe 20 of them. I mean, for me to see all these fresh faces, even though objectively it wasn't very many, was astonishing.
They weren't the same old people from the same meetings and the same tiny protests.
Exactly. And so I was like, wow, something's going on. There's new people here. I mean, you mentioned this, right? That a lot of people who gravitated to Zuccotti Park were neophytes. They were new to activism. And in a way, I was too. I mean, I wasn't new to the left. I had been on the quote unquote New York left for a long time, but I hadn't had a social movement to test myself with, to learn with, right? To be part of, to actually go, to move from being intellectually a leftist to like being in solidarity and being part of a movement, because there were no movements, so to speak of. Yeah, I mentioned it already, but definitely the post 9/11 atmosphere was tremendous. I mean, it squelched the global justice movement, which I caught sort of a tail end of. I think you and I both protested in Washington, D.C. against the IMF. A16, right? We were both there. And then it was over. It just dissipated, and the anti-war movement sort of never really got its footing. And, even when we managed to produce these huge crowds, we were dismissed as a focus group. And so the message from the establishment was really, don't even bother, don't bother protesting. And so one thing I think Occupy did, inspired by what was going on in the wider world, was it put defiant protests back on the map. It said, no, don't ask for permits. Don't engage in these kind of like predictable little protests where you come and you stand in the free speech zone. Push the envelope and have real energy in your actions. So it felt really powerful. It felt powerful to be there under the shadow of the Freedom Tower in Lower Manhattan 10 years after September 11th and say, we're going to change the political atmosphere.
Yeah, I definitely think one reason it took off was because it wasn't overly slick or focus grouped. It was messy in a way that's really different from the sorts of heavily choreographed media stunts that are so common among the more non-prophesized corners of the progressive left, including groups who are fighting for great things, etc. Occupy seemed authentic. And I think that's a reminder for those of us who are a bit older than today's median socialist to, even as I think it's important for us older people, older even if we're just barely around 40, even as we try to, even though it's fine, I think, and useful for us to impart some wisdom and historical context to people who are newer to the left, to not rigidly or cynically presume that we always know for certain what will work and what won't. Because when it came to Occupy, most of us movement veterans had no clue what was about to happen.
I totally agree with that. I think that was one of Occupy's first lessons for me. It was one of the first lessons it imparted was, I don't know what's going to happen. And that in that uncertainty is possibility. And Occupy was authentic. I mean, it was, to me, and I don't think I'm alone in this, it was such a revelation to go to this space. And on the one hand, it was a space of outrage. It was a space where all of us who were angry could come and meet, but it was also a space of imagination. It was a space where your ideas could take off. It was a space of camaraderie where you could commune with people and have all of these strange and interesting conversations with strangers. And life is messy. So, in that authenticity and in that crowd, there were all sorts of weird elements. There were all sorts of problems. The problems became more apparent as the weeks went on. But that it was like a magnet. Like some of us just could not stop going there because it was alive. And that energy is so powerful. And I think, I at the time was part of a kind of tendency. I wouldn't call it a faction because we weren't organized. It was part of a tendency that thought, I want to be part of a left that wields power. I was friends with David Graeber. He recruited me not only to Occupy Wall Street, but to the nascent debt resistance movement that I have kept organizing with. But I wanted some structure, some discipline, some strategy. I wanted to change. I want to change the balance of power. I wanted a socialist left. And so, 10 years later, what I want to do is balance those criticisms of Occupy and those feelings of the left I wanted to see with a kind of homage to the fact that its horizontalist, open characteristic actually was powerful too, right? Like you have to have both, because if you want to engage people, it's going to be a mess.
Occupy, we already mentioned it was inspired by the Arab Spring, of course, but also the movement of the squares in Greece and Spain, and also in the US, the mass protests and occupation of the Wisconsin state capitol in Madison, defending public sector collective bargaining rights against Governor Scott Walker, which began in February 2011. And then you also just mentioned Bloombergville, which was, I think, less nationally prominent than the protests in Madison, but were a big deal in New York. And I remember around the time of Madison that this phone number went out for a pizza place, and you could call and order pizza for Wisconsin protesters, and pizzas were just pouring in from all over the country. Thea and I ordered one from Philly, and there was this really deep desire by 2011, I think especially watching what was going on around the world, a deep desire on the left, for the left, to take some sort of major action in response to the economic crisis, because this is years after the crisis hit, but it kept seeming, especially after 2010, like it just wasn't happening at scale, and that in fact, most of the energy provoked by the financial crisis had been picked up by the political right. And then the initial liberal and left energies responding to the crash and crisis and to the entirety of George W. Bush's disastrous presidency, it mostly went into the Obama campaign initially. But then Wall Street got bailed out. Obama offered them impunity. As he put it to bank executives infamously, quote, "My administration is the only thing between you and the pitchforks." And it was this whole dynamic that the left kind of didn't have the wind at its back at all. And the Tea Party moved in and took advantage of scapegoating underwater homeowners getting bailed out for the crisis, even though such a bailout never happened, scapegoating them and all sorts of other purported parasites. How was it that the right initially, before Occupy finally took off, that the right initially managed to strike first in politically exploiting a banking crisis, something that you'd think the left would be all over?
It was unbearable to go through. It was just so deeply upsetting, right? So the Tea Party took off in 2009.
Yes.
And I believe it was tax day of that year. So April 15th, they had these national protests. And, it's popular, and it's not totally wrong to describe the Tea Party as an AstroTurf group. But, following the sociologist Theda Scotch poll, I think you can make a case that it was a real grassroots movement too. And hundreds of thousands of people across the country were out. And you're absolutely right. I mean, they were pointing an angry finger at the wrong target. I mean, specifically pointing it at Black mortgage holders, like the biggest victims of the financial crisis. I mean, we know now that the mortgage meltdown evaporated over 50% of the wealth of Black families and over 60% of the wealth of Latino families. And so, they also dominated the economics debate nationally. So the main frame before Occupy put inequality on the map was the debt ceiling debate. It was just austerity. I mean, we also didn't use the word austerity in the United States, but it's total austerity politics. It was like, because of the national debt, we cannot afford your entitlements.
Just like families around at kitchen tables around the country have to balance their books, so does the federal government. That was the vibe.
That was the vibe. And that is so not the world we're living in. I mean, I think now, post-COVID in this economic crisis, they made a bunch of resources available. There was still a political fight over who they went to, who benefited, right? But yeah, it was the debt ceiling debate. The consequence, though, of a multi-decade war on the left, it wasn't that the situation was spontaneously like that in the wake of the financial crisis. It was just that this was the neoliberal regime. I mean, who repealed Glass-Steagall and got rid of the Depression era boundaries between retail and investment banking? Well, Bill Clinton and, the Democrats in collaboration with their Republican colleagues. So there were all of these sort of betrayals. The political class had so failed people, from, the war on terror to the stagnating wages to, think about Hurricane Katrina. I mean, it just felt like there were all of these failures compounding. And in a way, and that's why Occupy refusing to have demands and kind of just saying the whole system's broken, right, resonated with people. Because you can sort of ask, well, what was Occupy protesting? But it's kind of more apt to be like, well, what wasn't it protesting? I mean, ostensibly it was the banking crisis, but it was also money in politics. It was also debt. It was also the lack of good jobs, thinking you'll never be able to retire. I mean, it was everything, because it was all connected. And, it was such a powerful shift to go from watching these movements on the screen, watching these uprisings in the Middle East and in Europe and then in Wisconsin, to then being part of one and seeing how quickly it caught on, because there were something like, over 900 encampments, maybe more, because I've heard that there were 400 in California alone at one point. I mean, so the public, even though the media was mocking us and saying that we were dirty hippies and we needed to get a job, regular people were sending those pizzas. There was Librato's Pizza. I might be misremembering the name, but there was a pizza shop and they were getting orders from around the damn world, right? And regular people were sending supplies and starting Occupies of their own, because it resonated. It resonated for a group that wasn't the Tea Party to say, shit is fucked up and bullshit.
And I think a big part of this was Obama's promise and then the reality of the Obama administration and this resulting pretty intense disillusionment. So many people who would go on to participate in Occupy had not only voted for Obama, but campaigned for him, invested these enormous hopes in his presidency. You remember those hagiographic posters with his face, which are unlike anything we had seen before in American politics and unlike anything we'll see again, I think. And then finally celebrated in the streets the night that he won. And I remember standing there in West Philly being pleased that he won, but also seeing this mass energy around Obama being a sign that the left didn't have any power or influence at all, really, and feeling very ambivalent at that moment. But all these people were out there in the streets in 2008. And then 3 years later, after Obama had spent 3 years standing between the people with their pitchforks and the bankers, things had changed pretty dramatically. How did that play out, that dynamic where this incredible ecstasy swung into disillusionment and then into Occupy?
I think it is important to remember that Obama ran on populist rhetoric, right? I mean, and yes, hope and change and all of that. And, it's kind of tragic because liberals on the left stood idly by, waiting for their messiah to take action, and basically, missed the window when Democrats held the House and the Senate and the presidency, right? I mean, they're just sort of like biding our time and going, okay, well, surely he's going to do something. And so you're absolutely right. It was, Occupy, and the research bears this out, that, a lot of people had participated in his campaign, had voted for him, had been hopeful, and were disillusioned. And that was kind of, in a way, the kind of makeup of the group that at least was at Zuccotti Park or planned those protests. In other words, there were people who had expectations that were being thwarted, right? So, a lot of people were students, but they were buried in student debt, right? So this sense of downward mobility, of not having their expectations be met. And I think that Obama was part of that. But then, again, like, it was evident the minute he took office, he had so many Wall Street bankers in his administration. I mean, it was pretty clear, where his loyalties were. It wasn't like such a bait and switch, It was such a disastrous failure because also this was a crisis he inherited. And there were even programs that he inherited he failed to put to use. So there's the HAMP program, which was, I think, the Home Affordable Modification Program, which is supposed to help modify mortgages for something like 4 million households. And under Obama, they helped 1 million. Meanwhile, just millions and millions of people lost their homes, lost their wealth. And then they failed to act even as loan servicers were illegally denying people access to these programs. I mean, the degree of criminal contempt for people who are suffering at that moment from the Obama administration, like, it's just really galling to remember. And so, people often ask, or people often say Occupy failed. And I just think, to me, I'm like, no, the political elites failed. I mean, it's just, I was there the first day. It was ridiculous to think the 400 people in that park were going to overturn the power structure, right? I mean, they were saying this is broken. It was this prescient warning of the discontent, and the suffering, that the system we have causes. And what's really sad is that warning wasn't taken up speedily, right? Like, in other words, it was the elites who caused the crisis that Occupy was responding to, and they failed yet again by refusing to, see the writing on the wall or the writing on the cardboard signs in the park.
Let's talk about Occupy the protest, which was, as we've talked about a little, in fact, many things. There was Occupy proper in Zuccotti Park in New York City, which included both the people camping out there full time, which was sort of the core, but then tons of regular visitors and sympathizers who came by the park, maybe almost daily, maybe sometimes, maybe to attend Occupy protests. Then, as you mentioned earlier, there were Occupies all over the country with their own full-time occupiers, their own less intensely involved sympathizers, visitors, protesters. I was in Philly working at the city paper at the time, and Occupy Philly was huge and a huge deal in Philly. So though New York looms largest, Occupy was often experienced and popularly interpreted through local occupations. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like this before or since. What was Occupy as simultaneously a national movement headquartered in Zuccotti Park and the series of local movements for which Zuccotti Park was an inspiration, but not necessarily the primary reference point? And finally, then what allowed for Occupy's tactic to be so quickly replicated everywhere?
Yeah, and it wasn't just around the country. I mean, there were Occupies around the world. I was traveling, I think, in early 2012 and visited Occupy Dublin that was still going strong. I mean, it became an international phenomenon. I went back and revisited the timeline, and, Occupy Gezi Square, in Turkey was after Occupy Wall Street. There was also the Hong Kong protests, right? So it had these like national, like sort of repercussions and international. And of course, it was in its own way, an answer to Occupy Syntagma Square, the M15 movement, the movement of the Indignados, as we've already said. So yeah, there was no real headquarters. Occupy wasn't a command center, but it was kind of an inspiration center. And part of the genius of the tactic of occupation is just that it's replicable. You see it and you go, okay, I get that. So I go to a place that's highly visible and hopefully has some symbolic value. I bring tents, and then, okay, we set up a library, we set up food distribution, we have some working groups, we have some teach-ins. I got this, and it was something that people could do and they could see themselves in. And then, in these cities, Occupies became a kind of meeting ground. And I think that's what their value is. That's why we can't end Occupy in November, when the park was cleared. Because more than anything else, what Occupy did was it created space for people to find each other. Again, a demoralized, atomized, alienated left, right? And you went there and you thought, I'm not alone. All of these other people are outraged. And the relationships that Occupy enabled and helped form, I think, are still fueling the left today, are still really powerful. Nathan Schneider, who was at the planning sessions for Occupy Wall Street and wrote a great book called Thank You, Anarchy, says, people went to Occupy thinking they were going to a protest and they found a school. And I really love that because, again, it was a place for those of us who wanted to be part of social movements, who wanted to be, quote unquote, on the left, to learn how to do it. I didn't know how to organize my way out of a paper bag when I got to Occupy Wall Street. And it was this forum for learning. And sometimes learning is going, well, I don't like that. I disagree with this. I think that's the wrong tactic. I think you're an idiot. But it was like a place for those kinds of debates. So what I did when I got to Occupy was I did the thing I knew how to do, which was write and edit. And so I, with some friends from from N+1, the magazine, and others, we launched something called the Occupy Gazette. Actually, we called it an OWS inspired Gazette because we wanted to make clear we weren't like speaking for the movement, but we were inspired by it. And we made 5 or 6 issues over the year. And what it did, what was great about it was I was able to commission pieces from not just all over the country, but all over the world. So I commissioned pieces from Cincinnati, Occupy Atlanta, Occupy
Nikhil Saval from Occupy Philadelphia.
Yeah, Nikhil Saval was one of the editors. He wrote a piece on Occupy Philadelphia, Occupy Wilmington, North Carolina, Occupy Oakland, which was like the really militant Occupy that my disabled sister Sonora Taylor was camping out at. And I remember tuning into the live stream, and it was like this war zone with tear gas and just seeing this little figure in a wheelchair on the screen and being like, oh no, they're beating up my sister. So there were, and
Oakland always turns things up to 11.
Oakland, yeah, we got to give Oakland some credit here. They also, had an amazing action where they shut down the port. That was a really powerful show of force and brought in an interesting collaboration with the Longshoremen's Union. So that was, it was really interesting for me to get all these reports from the fields or from within occupied buildings or occupied homes, and to see the sort of connecting threads or tissues in all of those. And it kind of reinforced for me my personal desire to keep organizing around indebtedness, because that was a kind of key theme that kept coming up. But without a doubt, those little groups all over the country, sparked relationships, sparked campaigns. So I can speak to Occupy Athens, Georgia. I'm from Athens, Georgia. That the Occupy group renamed itself, called itself Athens for Everyone, and basically ran occupiers for the city commission. So that's just like one story of what Occupy did in one little town. And there must be thousands of those stories, and I just don't know them.
Yeah, no less of a card-carrying socialist than Bhaskar Sunkara wrote, quote, "Occupy has been tactically adaptive, owing in large part to a creative wellspring within the anarchist movement."
Kind words. I mean, it's true. I think this is why, as much as I, say and said, I'm not an anarchist, I disagreed with these aspects, I really appreciated the creativity and conviction. And I think that's really essential to movements, and this feeling that you're not taking your marching orders. When you got to the space of these occupations, you were invited to be creative, to be a participant.
And you could get plugged in right away to a significant role in this entire prefigurative universe, the libraries, kitchens, medical care.
Exactly. And there was an immediate sense for people that they mattered, which is for people in this society is really huge. A friend also wrote me the other day something I think is important. And she said, actually, two friends wrote this. They said that, Occupy also, it didn't kind of have a radical litmus test. It was for the 99%. And so you could come there and be a bit uncertain, or you could be a liberal, or you could just be a tourist. You could be curious, and you could participate. You were welcomed. And that meant that some of the messaging was often a little cringy, but I think that was really powerful. Like, it created space for people to learn. I mean, another friend wrote me and said that he had been an MSNBC watching liberal until Occupy, but it was a place where people like that could come and be like, what's going on? What is Citizens United? What is capitalism? What actually happened in the banking crisis? And so that kind of wide open door, I think, is really powerful. And it's something we need to keep in mind as we aspire to build a sort of broad-based movement, right? A big left, a big tent, that sort of spirit that, believed in people and welcomed people. That said, to Bhaskar's point about it being tactical, when the camp was cleared, there was a drive among some people, to occupy their spaces. So there were quite a few attempts to reoccupy, to find new territory. And that was, people started to mistake, in my view, a tactic for the goal.
Or for a strategy.
Right, for a strategy, right? Like, and it was like, well, no, the tactic is a tool, and maybe it's played itself out in this context. We are outmaneuvered. Like, we are not as powerful as the state, and we are not as powerful as the police. And, so I think the offshoots of Occupy that were more generative were those that were like, okay, we need to take this movement and its focus on inequality, the attention to capitalism, and we need to carry it forward in less literal fashions.
Yeah, and that included immediate successors to Occupy, including Occupy Homes, which spun off in Atlanta and Minnesota, I believe. Occupy Sandy, this massive mutual aid operation in New York after Hurricane Sandy. Then something you know quite a bit about, Strike Debt's Debt Jubilee, which ultimately, if I have it right, led to the Debt Collective. There was also Occupy the SEC, whose comments helped shape the Volcker Rule, curbing bank leverage.
Right. And Occupy Sandy, was a really powerful thing because it was also a kind of moment of redemption for Occupy. So it was 2012, universally praised by the New York Times, praised by the Department of Homeland Security, which wrote a report that was like, wow, this decentralized relief effort really works. And it also has the interesting statistic that Occupy Sandy mobilized 60,000 volunteers, right? So these were the kinds of networks that were formed during Occupy Wall Street and that were there to be activated. So that was interesting. And then, Strike Debt began as a working group at Occupy. So once again, David Graeber, as I mentioned, he recruited me and he said, Astra, there's this group forming. And for me, the insights really, really came directly out of my experiences at Zuccotti Park. I mean, I've told this story many, many times, but on my second or third day at Zuccotti Park, there was a young man and he was speaking in the voice of a carnival barker. And he said, step right up and write down what you're worth to the 1%. He had these huge pieces of paper. And I had to take a breath and walk around the park before I went to him and got in line and wrote my $42,000 of student loans because I just hated facing that number. I had just defaulted on them. And this young woman behind me wrote down 120,000. And then these other people were writing their medical debt and their housing. It was something people were really discussing. And it was such a breakthrough because it was something so shrouded in shame up until that point. I mean, I had never been in public where we were all like, how much debt do you have? I guess I'll never own a house. Hey, me neither. I can't pay. And, we went from I can't pay to then going like, maybe we shouldn't pay. And so we began, as nerds do, we began researching the financial sector, really digging into theories of financialization, but through an organizing lens. Like, what would it take to organize around this, to build strategic power around this? So it was actually at Occupy Wall Street in 2012, actually at Zuccotti Park, where the call for student debt cancellation was first raised. There was a big protest called 1T Day. It was the day student debt surpassed $1 trillion. It was organized by the Occupy Student Debt Campaign. And I'm someone who does not forget. And I remember that Reuters and NPR totally mocked this action and said, the government's never going to cancel debt. And here we are in 2021. And in this year alone, thanks to the Debt Collective, which is the group I helped found that emerged out of this, Joe Biden has erased almost $10 billion in student debt alone. Now, has he met his full campaign promise? No. And we're still organizing to make him do that. But the fact is, Joe Biden, Obama's vice president, and Mr. former senator of Delaware, the credit card capital of the world, the friends of, the longtime friend of creditors, campaigned on debt cancellation. And that would not happen without Occupy.
Yeah, we're going to get more into legacy later, but on this issue of debt, it's a very clear-cut one where things like the demand for the abolition of debt and the right to free college, neither of those things would be anywhere close to so prominent in American politics without Occupy.
Yeah, I'm biased, but I agree.
One other thing we should mention about what daily life was like at the actual occupations proper, with the food and medical care and books and so many of the other sorts of services that neoliberal society denies people, was that ultimately a lot of homeless people joined the occupations. And I think this proved challenging for the occupations in some ways, but it was also, I think, quite a beautiful thing. So many people taking care of each other that way.
It was often phrased in the media as a problem. I mean, the media was so vicious to Occupy. I went back and looked at some of it. I mean, there were so many gotcha pieces from the New York Times, from CNN, from the mainstream, late night comedians of the day. And so, the question of houseless people at Occupy was raised, as though it was always framed as a problem. And it was a challenge, right? Because, as Occupy said, they're trying to build this, kind of utopian society in the shell of a society that is like absolutely serrated by social division, by conflict, by poverty, by need. And there's definite evidence that the NYPD, was pushing people to come to Zuccotti Park, right? So there is a story actually in the Occupy book I edited that came out from Verso in 2012, which has an interview with a guy who slept uptown and he was woken up, and he had for years, and everyone in the neighborhood knew who he was. And the cops sort of kick him awake one night and say, there's a complaint about you. You need to go to Zuccotti Park. And the guy was like, I don't think anyone's complaining about me. I've been here forever. This is actually my home. I sleep here every night. And it is challenging to fill in the huge gaps created by capitalism. I mean, Occupy could barely begin to meet people's needs. I mean, we need so much. We need healthcare, we need education, we need mental health care, we need, all connection, we need meaningful work. And I think it's kind of impressive how much Occupy was able to provide those things. I mean, on the meaningful work front, one of the best signs that Occupy was always, I lost my job, but I found an occupation. Right. And one of the favorite insults from bankers passing by was get a job,
Hippie.
Take a shower, get a job. And it was like they couldn't see that we were doing meaningful work. We were working, and of course, a lot of us had jobs. A lot of us had 2 or 3 jobs, a lot of us had lost our jobs because they had freaking like sunk the economy, right? Like, if people didn't have jobs, it was on them. But, Occupy was able to provide meaningful labor, even if it wasn't remunerated. So I think one, to follow up on the comment though about people are homeless, one of the main things I think that local occupies actually transformed into, or maybe not main, but a dominant theme as local occupies evolved, were actually groups that kept working with the homeless and kept up, either various forms of solidarity, whether kitchens or defending homeless shelters and stuff like that. So I actually think there was a lot of awareness that emerged out of Occupy and a lot of activism. And ultimately, Occupy was a response to a housing crisis. And in that sense, what's really tragic is we're kind of in an analogous moment, as we sit on the brink of an eviction crisis, as the protections expire and unemployment benefits end and stuff like that. It was in keeping with the reason we were there, which is people are losing their homes and the society doesn't support us. I think what's interesting now, though, 10 years later, now that we have an actual left, is that we're talking about things like social housing. Like, housing shouldn't be a commodity. It shouldn't be a speculative asset. You should get to live in a home, I don't know, a product or something that you hope appreciates and values so you might be able to retire, right? That kind of thinking, I think we said like housing's a human right at Occupy, but we weren't talking about like social housing, let alone green social housing. And so I think that's a sign of, in a way, the situation today is worse in terms of objective conditions and wealth inequality. But I think the terms of the debate are a bit more astute.
We should also mention that Occupy definitely existed on the internet, on Twitter, of course, and also on this amazing Tumblr where people posted photos holding up handwritten posters or notes, if I remember correctly, explaining what life experiences had led them to support Occupy, losing a job, debt, etc. And this was this moment also when people were trying to think about what the internet and social media meant for politics and activism. Sometimes I think in a hyperbolic or faddish way that didn't have a lot of rigor, but that doesn't mean that there weren't important things happening with social media and the internet. What do you think that the internet meant for Occupy and for the left more generally that was reemerging at the time?
Yeah, you're talking about We Are the 99% Tumblr. And so one thing before I get into the technology of that is, again, that for people to share their debt, to share their stories of hardship was so powerful, because I think that's something that has been destigmatized a lot. And that's part of having a left where you go, okay, these are structural problems. It's not your personal failings. It's not that you failed to lift yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, you're impoverished by design. You're indebted by design. And so for people to come out and literally coming out, right, and saying, I can't make ends meet was a really powerful thing. And the internet made it easy for people who weren't somewhere where they could go to an encampment and do it by holding that cardboard sign to add their voice to the chorus. Occupy was always this really neat mix aesthetically of technology, of Twitter and Facebook and Tumblr, and then like these really, really just rustic or whatever, like simple cardboard signs, right? Like it had this mix of very lo-fi and hi-fi together. I was writing, at the time of Occupy, I was writing my book, The People's Platform. So I was thinking a lot about the internet. And one thing that stood out to me was that these pundits, people I was critiquing in the book as kind of social media internet cheerleaders, were going on and on and on about the Arab Spring and the face, and they would in Iran, it was the Twitter revolution, and then Egypt was the Facebook revolution. And oh, did we hear a couple had named their child Facebook? And, I was always very skeptical of these guys too, because they never talked about the need for a revolution at home, right? Like it was always some distant place that the internet was liberating.
And it always somehow seemed to end up just crediting U.S. tech overlords for spreading progressive social change elsewhere.
Exactly. Like those people need our technology to bring, we're bringing democracy to them through these, basically colonial means.
Pat on the back, American capitalism.
Exactly. And I thought was really interesting was that the lesson, though, that all of us who had been watching these revolutions on live streams, the lessons we took from it was like, yeah, it's important to get the word out. It's important to live stream. But what's really important is going in your body to a public place. Right. So in other words, the sort of chattering class was fetishizing the tech and, giving the Silicon Valley tools as credit. But regular people were like, oh, we need to meet in space as embodied humans and find each other, and defy the authorities together in real time, in real space. And so I just was always very struck by the fact that people actually took, they weren't taking a kind of determinist or tech fetishist lesson from these technologically mediated revolutions. I mean, I interviewed Nalini Stamp, who was a very visible figure at Occupy and Direct Action, all sorts of working groups. And, she's been involved in basically every movement, since then about Occupy's legacy. And she pointed out that, in the United States, Occupy was the first movement that live streamed everything, that had that constant, updating of the Twitter feed. Transparency was a really big theme in Occupy, right? So people would tweet out, there was no messaging discipline. You tweet out all of the ugliness and all the conflicts and everything like that. And what that enabled, in addition to sort of transmitting the tactics, right? Bring a tent, set up a food station, set up a library. What it did was it enabled all of these local occupiers to feel connected to the national narrative and to this global narrative. And it was the first time that we really, sort of experienced that here in the US. And so in that sense, I think Occupy kind of changed protest in two ways. One, it brought back this kind of defiance and this sort of, we're not doing the choreographed thing. And then also, and you live stream it and you spread the word that way.
Even critics of Occupy acknowledged almost immediately that it did a lot to change the terms of the political debate with this new emphasis on economic inequality, the 1% elite versus the 99% majority, and just like the return of class politics as a frame to think about what was wrong with America and the world, something that really was not much of a frame in American politics, or hadn't been much of a frame in American politics for decades. And even beyond that, Sarah Jaffe wrote in 2013 that it wasn't just changing the narrative, but something really even deeper. She writes, quote, "Occupy killed what British professor Mark Fisher, in his slim, cutting little book of the same name, calls capitalist realism." What did that new language feel like at the time, and what were its shorter and longer term impacts?
It's interesting. The claim that Occupy changed the conversation that first year, so late 2011, 2012, it actually used to hurt my heart, because I just was like, I want to do more than change the conversation. I want to make the capitalist class quake.
It seemed very insufficient.
It seems so inefficient. And I think now, though, I'm like, that was no small feat. I mean, it was again, kids, let me tell you how bleak it was, right? And so part of why I threw down with Occupy was because I had been waiting, since the demise of the global justice movement for a movement focused on class, on economics. I think what was powerful about Occupy, because to me they're connected, right? It was through the global justice movement that I learned, for example, about the politics of debt, specifically the sovereign debt crisis, neocolonialism through financial means, trade agreements, NAFTA, all of this. But there was something to the global justice movement that still felt a bit removed, like we're fighting for others. Occupy was so powerful because it was populist, and it was like, we're fighting for us. We are the 99%. And yes, the 99% is actually global, but it had this self-interest that I think movements, they don't all need to tap into that, but it's really powerful when they do, right? The solidarity that can come from self-interest when it's in that, class conscious frame is just what I was craving. I don't know. I was just like, and I was like, okay, this is a kind of silly encampment in a park, but they're talking about class and I am in. Like, I am in. And people are like, are you going to make a documentary about it? And I was like, no, I'm not sitting on the sidelines, like filming the demise. I'm going to paddle like as fucking hard as I can, because like, if we don't start talking about the material conditions, economic structures, like we're doomed. So yeah, I think Sarah is right. I met, and of course I met Sarah at Occupy Wall Street marching around. And like many of us, because again, I was a documentarian, a writer, I think there were a lot of us who were journalists who chose a side, and we're, Natasha Leonard famously got arrested on the Brooklyn Bridge. She was a New York Times correspondent, but, I think there are just tons of people where we were like, we are not going to pretend that we're neutral, in this, we are going to infuse our work with a class conscious lens and sensibility, and, sort of be unrelenting about that. So I think changing the conversation was again, it was no small feat, but to me, what Occupy did, it wasn't just a kind of narrative thing. Again, it opened the space where those of us who wanted to be engaged on the left could then find comrades to start doing stuff, so, it's really, I just wrote a piece about the 10-year anniversary of Occupy. I'm writing it with Jonathan Smucker, who has been a guest on The Dig before. He wrote a great book called Hegemony How To. He was in the public relations working group at Zuccotti Park, which is how I know him, and, interviewing people who went on to found the Sunrise Movement, whose first experience with activism was being 19, 20 years old and being at Occupy Wall Street or Occupy Los Angeles and being caught up in the excitement, the effervescence, and then also seeing what didn't work about it and being really intentional as they built their organization about taking the good parts and trying to leave behind some of the stuff that didn't work. And so I think that's one of its most powerful legacies, right? I mean, movements are always spaces to learn.
Yeah, really. I mean, there's so much to get into in terms of Occupy's legacy, but it just, in the most concrete sense, it radicalized so many individuals. It really radicalized a generational cohort. Almost any sort of U.S. left or social movement organization, if you start looking at who active leaders are, especially active leaders who are somewhere in their 30s, we're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of people who now play key roles on the left who otherwise might not be doing what they're doing.
Sociological, I mean, I'm not a sociologist and I don't even play one on the radio, but I have read that a big indicator of whether you're going to keep being a political person is participating in a social movement when you're younger, right? So there's no, we don't want to be simplistic in our generational analysis, but there's no doubt that a cohort can be formed, right? Shaped by something. I shudder to think of a world in which there was no Occupy and there was just the Tea Party responding to the financial sector. And Occupy was very different than the Tea Party. It was allergic to electoral interventions. It definitely didn't have the same degree of billionaires at its back. I mean, Ben and Jerry's are no match for the Koch brothers. And we certainly didn't have a cable news network. We had Twitter and the live streams. But yeah, I think those experiences can really shape a collective sensibility, and we don't quite know yet, what the ultimate ramifications are.
In terms of the term, the 99%, a lot was going on there. On the one hand, it gestured toward the fact that the left, after years on the margins and sort of getting comfortable on the margins, that the left needed to engage in a majoritarian sort of politics to win. On the other hand, the term was criticized plenty especially for obscuring the many inequalities, particularly racial inequalities among the 99%. It also papered over the fact that the 99% includes portions of the rich and some very well-off upper middle classes. And interestingly, in retrospect, I think the 99% has had quite a bit less staying power than the 1%, which is still very much with us. What do you make of this maximally inclusive populist framing of the we, of the people?
I don't think you can deny that it had power because it caught on like wildfire, right? I mean, again, it was it filled this vacuum. And so whatever criticisms you have of the term, it worked. People saw themselves in the 99%. People understood who the 1% was, and that was so refreshing, to name the culprits, to name the them that is exploiting us. And so, I think the job of addressing those fissures and those divisions of race, of gender, of geography, even, right? That's the job of organizing and solidarity. I don't think a slogan can actually do that, right? Like, I don't think it's just a messaging problem. Like, oh, well, actually, I've come up with this term that unites us all while acknowledging our differences, and now we're all in a united front. Like, no, I mean, that's a harder kind of work we got to do. So, I mean, I think it was messaging genius. And, I think that you do need to dig into the percentages and be like, actually, it's actually the 0.01% and not the 1%. Or actually it's the 10%, 1%, if you're writing tax policy, but what we were trying to do as Occupy was break the spell of neoliberalism. Again, this capitalist realism point. And so I think the 99%, was really a powerful frame to do that. Occupy also got a lot of heat for not having demands.
Yeah.
And in a way, I think that functioned in the same way, right? By again, there's the March and May of that year that had lots of demands. I mean, to me, people would write these op-eds and they'd be like, Occupy is so silly. It doesn't have demands. And I just always wanted to say, you're the fucking silly one. Like, do you think that's how politics works? Like, you think that if I write up my demands just right, and there's like no typos, and then I put on a suit and I go and I deliver them to the powers that be, that they're like, wow, your demands are so smart. Let me implement them. Like, no, this is a freaking power struggle. I mean, Occupy was powerful because its lack of demands, what it did was it created space for, again, liberals, leftists, for disenchanted working class people, middle class people to see themselves and then get sucked into a movement that was actually saying the whole system's guilty. We need such a huge transformation that we can't distill it in a single demand, right? Like, it's not just repealing Citizens United. It's not just reinstating Glass-Steagall. It's bigger than that. So I think it was, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't have movements that have demands. I mean, I've gone on and founded and organized a movement that has demands. But I think Occupy did the right thing at the right time and was much more savvy than the critics on the sidelines gave it credit for. And I came to believe, in my experience at Occupy, that the real utopians are kind of the critics, right? Like, they're like, they're like dreaming of the perfect movement that doesn't ruffle their feathers the wrong way, and that doesn't have any chaos. It doesn't have any people who are annoying. It definitely doesn't have a drum circle. I mean, I dream of such a movement too, but that's not how it is. That's not what it is to organize. That's not what it is to engage with other people, and as long as you kind of stay in that position of being the critic, then your ideas are never tested. You're always able to imagine, how things should be done or what the outcome should be. And it's a really humbling thing to go from a kind of spectator to a participant, and to go from someone who kind of philosophizes to someone who organizes, and I say that as someone who kind of made that leap during Occupy. And I can tell you, man, that organizing is a lot harder than making documentaries about philosophy and writing books.
And it seemed to be expecting something of Occupy that Occupy just couldn't deliver, and sort of misunderstood what Occupy was. My take is that Occupy couldn't, in many ways, articulate more than it did. It was, I think, a necessarily open-ended, short-lived movement that allowed for everyone to come together, precisely because the reality was that there was not really a left in existence at that time. There were not specific proposals or demands or specific visions. The left's politics were inchoate at the time. And so I think Occupy, precisely the role, at least in retrospect, that it ended up serving, was for there to be a venue for a left that did not yet have its politics defined to begin to come together and have the conversations and take the actions that would lay the groundwork for the left to grow and come into its own. It couldn't. Demanding that Occupy do otherwise would have been putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, in this piece that Jonathan Smucker and I just wrote, we at one point talk about Occupy as a bridge. And it was a bridge between the left of the late 90s, right? So the global justice left, a very anarchist inflected left, and the left we have today, which is far less ambivalent about leadership, about structure, about taking power, and is more socialist. And it's really interesting because I think, I felt like I was a bit against the current. As much as I was a staunch defender of Occupy and again wanted to paddle as hard as I could to make, to be part of the movement, to be part of that uprising, I didn't think, oh, well, what we'll have in 10 years is like a revival of democratic socialism. I would have been very happy to learn that at the time. But, there was a different kind of mode of doing politics that was dominant. And it was, again, it did, it had aspects that I want to honor. It respected people's autonomy. It aspired to cultivate freedom and equality, and had a kind of commitment to consensus and really engaging people. But it also was, kind of reveled in its weakness, right? So people talked about, not taking power as if that was a good thing. That wasn't where I was at. That wasn't the kind of left I wanted to be part of. So I think Occupy was a bridge that paradoxically put us in the present moment, which has more of a connection to kind of the left of the 30s, right? So now people talk about the Green New Deal and this language of a class conscious, a kind of class conscious politics that's really different. I mean, it's not that they weren't class conscious. It's just that there was it was really this allergy to power. And I think now the left is, open to sort of organizing on all fronts. It's like, you have to figure out how to engage in electoral terrain and unions and labor organizing and debt and, housing justice. And like, what I think is a very, kind of common sense observation, which is we have to do it all if we want to win.
Yeah, on Twitter, Matt Collado or Collado, I might be mispronouncing, he wrote on Twitter, quote, "The fetishization of procedure which marked Occupy was a grand finale of the 90s Seattle, Genoa, anarchist-influenced era. It provoked a backlash amongst the following Sandinista DSA generation, inoculating them against the previous generation's allergy to leadership." A lot of that seems right in some ways because Occupy's horizontalism was informed, I think, by the sort of Gen X left's anti-globalization era anarchist-infused politics. But then many of the millennials who tried that at Occupy went on to embrace and develop a more socialist politics that have become dominant on the left ever since then. Why was it that Occupy functioned as this sort of hinge point at that moment?
I mean, it's interesting. So as I said at Zuccotti Park that day, there were a lot of people that I didn't know, but the people I did know were mostly from the global justice movement. So David Graeber, who had been, he wrote a book called Direct Action that was about decentralized organizing, horizontalism. Marina Citrin, who I believe she might even have been the one who sort of shared the technique of the people's microphone. And she had spent a lot of time in Argentina writing about horizontalism. And these folks were absolutely pivotal in getting Occupy off the ground. And then once it started going, even more sort of veterans of that movement came. So they had a kind of, anarchist ethos. And that dovetailed with some of the other people who were from this internet politics, anonymous kind of crowd too, that was also, we're a swarm, we're leaderless. And so it was an interesting intersection of those worlds combining. And I think I'm in this moment 10 years later where I'm like, okay, but obviously something they did worked because right. I'm talking about Occupy 10 years later, right? Like, because when we start getting too hyper organized, too rigid, then our movements start to be choreographed. They start to be predictable. They start to not be alive. Like messiness is a sign of life, right? So there's something to that we don't want to lose if we want our movements to really live. I think what injected, again, the global justice movement had this kind of distant quality. I think it was just the moment, the post-crash moment where people were downwardly mobile. They felt this new level of insecurity. I'm going to be worse off than my parents. And once you do that, once you start thinking about class in that way and capitalism in that really direct way, it leads you to socialist politics. It leads you to a different kind of thinking. And then also people just saw some of the shit show, that's the technical word for it, where claims to leaderlessness were not matched by reality, and that wasn't a revelation from Occupy. I mean, there's the famous feminist Joe Freeman's essay, The Tyranny of Structurelessness, right? That a lot of times movements that claim to be leaderless, what it does, it means they're leaders, but they're not accountable. And certainly that was the case. So there was the General Assembly in New York. I can only speak to New York, but there were all these affinity groups kind of doing stuff behind the scenes, and nobody's accountable. Like, sure, you're autonomous, but it's like, where do you hook up into the whole, how do people actually know what you're doing in Occupy's name? And so, people rightfully, I think, thought there has to be a better way. And so you see that even in Black Lives Matter, where people, the refrain was, we're not leaderless, we're leaderful. And that was actually going back to Ella Baker, so these questions of leadership, hierarchy, horizontalism, structure, these are like eternal debates on the left. But I think Occupy was a really dramatic example of the failures of a well-intentioned move, right? Like, okay, let's not be authoritarian. Let's not treat people like they're just puppets who have to show up to a march and then listen to these speakers and then like go home,
And let's not act like a weird Stalinist, cult or whatever.
Right. Like, hey, that was kind of like not as much, it's shitty in its effects. It makes you feel shitty. I mean, I've been to a million marches where like, okay, you march and you listen to the speakers and you just feel like, why would I even show up? Occupy made it feel like it mattered that you showed up. So it was the intentions and the spirit are actually right on. Things just get taken to an extreme. And so, dealing with these things is like why I went on up after Occupy to make my film, What is Democracy? And write my book about democracy, which is all about how democracy is all these paradoxes, right? Like we have to hold these tensions. We have to be able to, there's not some perfect recipe for like, okay, this much autonomy and this much structure. Like we're trying to figure those things out. But I think people, this generation, I think they're just starting on a way better foot by being like, we need institutions, we need infrastructure, we need to cultivate leadership. That leadership needs to be accountable, but we also need to be democratic, small d democratic. This to me is a sign that the left is learning. It's not, everywhere we want to be, but we've done more than change the conversation. We're building structures that can help us be more powerful.
And it's easy to diss on anarchists these days as not having much of an impact on things. But at the time, they had the anti-globalization movement and then Occupy, to their credit. And most members of socialist orgs, and I'm sure this is going to annoy some listener, most members of socialist orgs that you met at the time were just trying to sell you newspapers.
They were so annoying. I'm going to just get the hate mail with you. Like, why would you want to be associated with them? I'm sorry. I mean, and this is the thing. This is why I was like, at least my anarchist friends are doing things. And like, I have a little bit of an anarchist in me. I'm not going to lie. So let's do it. And they built a movement that, again, with the 99% as the frame and the demandless frame, actually was inviting to all kinds of people, and that also, again, that is to their credit. It wasn't a sectarian movement. It was strategically open. And, and again, here we are talking about it 10 years on.
And before we get any farther, we should probably pause to just have you describe what the General Assembly was and how it operated, including through the use of the people's mic.
General Assembly was, the most basic way you could ever imagine direct democracy. So again, Occupy was born of a disappointment with electoral politics and with representative democracy. Is the sense that the people who represent us don't represent us. They're completely marinated in corporate donations. And so it kind of thing where, okay, let's throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, let's have no representation. Let's have a direct democratic assembly. And the inspiration had come from seeing these forums used to great effect in Argentina, in Greece, and elsewhere. And so Occupy, I think it ran on a system of modified consensus. So you had to reach a 90% threshold, and for something to pass, and people could block proposals, which means that one person could stand up and say, I'm so against this idea that I block it. And that I think it's important to kind of give the, I've never been a proponent of consensus. So I'm going to try to put aside my view and just say what the people who support it believe. And it comes from a laudable idea that, everybody matters. We don't want to just have the 51% dominate the 49%, right? We want to find solution that people actually support, and so we want to talk it out. Now, I think that idealism sounds even more incredible. And actually, I almost feel a bit nostalgic for it in this moment, because I think we're so polarized. I mean, that's a word liberals use a lot, but I mean, it's like this radical left movement that was like, hey, we disagree, let's work it out together. Right? I mean, it seems I almost can't imagine that today. And maybe there's something in that we need to revive. I'm not
something
sure.
Either utopian or naive, depending on how one looks at it.
Yeah. And so these were open. They happened twice a day. But, in my memory, they're always happening at dusk. They're like at the magic hour. And because electric amplification was illegal, people would use the people's microphones. So you would repeat so that people in the back could hear, right? You'd repeat this statement. So, it felt to be part of them like you're part of this moving, breathing piece of poetry. And they actually were fine for running the camp. I mean, I think one thing Marina Citron would say, who I mentioned before, is that, these General Assemblies work when there's very concrete things being decided. So like things were decided like, well, how do we do the laundry? This camp produces a lot of laundry. Should we buy some storage bins for the food station? Should we bail out our comrades at Occupy Oakland? Yes, we should. We have lots of money because we're Occupy Wall Street, so yes, money should go to bail. It was great for stuff like that. It was harder for things that were more lasting because there was such turnover, right? Like, because anyone could show up. So there was a weakness, right? You could have the right of voting essentially, but without the responsibility of having to follow your decision through or even be ever coming back. Of course, blocks could be very contentious. It's just not a model that scales, and by the end, they had really devolved. I mean, I remember one night, this was after the eviction, when there's kind of this like ghost of Occupy hanging out in the park. And people were
Rump
still
Occupy.
Yeah, exactly. And just like really sad pseudo General Assembly, and someone got punched and it was live streamed. And I was like, this is bad, man. We need to move on, but it was a kind of political theater. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way, because theater can be really powerful. Like for people who have been completely estranged from small d democracy their whole lives, it was freaking exhilarating to participate in a General Assembly and be like, are we staying? Are we keeping the park? Are we moving? And you all decide together to stay, I mean, it was like, it's completely energizing, but it was also doomed from the beginning. And some of the more experienced people involved in the global justice movement tried to swerve and pivot to a different model, a spokes council model that had been used, in the past in their movements. And like occupiers were not having it. Like they were just like so committed to the General Assembly.
I think they approved some sort of modified spokes system just like a week or two before the NYPD cleared people out.
It was so contentious, man. I think those were some of the more intense meetings. And in my opinion, like the spokes council model is still too democratic. It's still not,
it's too horizontal. Yeah,
it's still too horizontal. Like,
but it was too hierarchical for a lot of occupiers at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Even though that was a very standard structure from the anti-globalization movement.
Yeah, and okay, so the spokes council model, for people who don't know, is just basically like you have working groups, then the working groups are represented. So it kind of has a I guess you could say a quasi-representative function, instead of like every person having to be there at the meeting at every time, right? Like it was like your spokes on a wheel. And what it was meant to do was, as Occupy got bigger and unwieldy, and there were 100 working groups, that those working groups could, meet at the spokes council and have a bit more efficiency. And it was absolutely disastrous.
This is Sarah Jaffe, and you are listening to The Dig with Daniel Denver, my favorite podcast for thoughtful discussions on the U.S. left and beyond, and you can support it on patreon.com.
Chris Brooks wrote on Twitter, quote, "A common summation among organizers on the left is that Occupy didn't accomplish much of anything, or that it only changed the narrative around inequality and how our pay-to-play political system works to the benefit of corporations." Do you think that Occupy is or was sort of underappreciated in retrospect by the American left? For a while, at least in the couple years following Occupy, it seemed as though people were really down on it, including Occupy veterans burnt out on the intensity, infighting, whatever. And then amongst people like New York Times financial columnist Andrew Ross Sorkin, there was kind of this schadenfreude and gloating. He wrote a year after Occupy started, quote, it will be an asterisk in the history books if it gets mentioned at all. But I don't think that's the case anymore, and I don't even think that was the case by midway through the last decade. As occupied Wall Street Journal editor Michael Levitin wrote in The Atlantic in 2015, quote, "Ironic as it may seem, the impact of the movement that many view only in the rearview mirror is becoming stronger and clearer with time." Do you agree that the sort of retrospective assessment of Occupy, very much including on the left and among Occupy leaders and participants, that changed a bit?
I mean, I'm sympathetic to people who felt burnt out and had this sort of feeling of what the fuck was that, like in the aftermath, because it was kind of a vortex that we got sucked into, and there were ugly elements at the end, you know. I mean, because these directly democratic structures were just unstable,
and there were some real toxic weirdos running around who these structures allowed to run around and disrupt things with impunity. I mean, like every occupation, I think, had a few Ron Paul and the Fed weirdos and all kinds of other people.
Yeah, I remember this one day really, really vividly. This one guy who would consistently come down there with these horrible signs. Maybe they're like anti-Semitic, anti-biker signs. And these two older women would just flank him and be like, who pays this guy to be here? Like, he doesn't represent us. So in other words, like, you know, and they just followed him around like for days on end until he finally left. But, you know, absolutely. That said, even a structured movement is a challenge, a structured organization. You know, we're seeing all of these very well organized nonprofits falling apart because of toxic personalities that their structures actually enable. So, I mean, I think these are, on some level, I'm like, when you're organizing with people or when you're dealing with people, you're going to have people problems, right? And so we're still trying to figure out structures that are small d democratic, that ensure accountability, that don't like ossify into oligarchy.
Right. And when you're not the authoritarian right and are trying to resist the iron law of oligarchy, you're not going to be able to just snuff out the difficulties of dealing with human beings.
Yeah, in that sense, you know, as is the case in so many areas, the left's job is harder because we're, you know, actually pro-human. So yeah, I think it made sense. I mean, I would say, to be totally honest, there was even a period when Bernie's 2016 campaign was, you know, sabotaged and Trump was on the rise, where I was like, freaking fuck, I've, you know, contributed to this populist energy. I mean, I went to some Trump rallies as part of my work on my film, What is Democracy? And, you know, I was like, this guy's got all of this anti-hedge fund messaging. Like it was almost like he was about to condemn the 1%, you know? And so I guess I'm just saying that I've had my own, you know, conflict about it as well. But I think what I couldn't see as I went off with my offshoot to organize around debt was all the other offshoots, all of those other projects, all of those other people who were actually wrestling with the same issues I was, or who had been kind of generally awakened by the new class conscious discourse in America and were joining DSA. And so that's why I agree with Michael that, you know, we don't have a full accounting of the impact yet. I mean, I was listening to some people who are more closely aligned with the labor movement talking about Occupy's impact in that space and the fight for 15, right? I mean, there are all of these ways that Occupy influenced these other domains that I don't feel like I have the personal, you know, sort of credibility to speak to, because I'm not sort of in the weeds like I am around debt and stuff like that. But, you know, they were saying, yeah, this was a huge sort of revitalization for a more bound, you know, labor movement. So you don't know. And I think this is one thing, you know, I definitely got this from reading Hope in the Dark, which is a book Rebecca Solnit wrote in 2003 or 4, sort of much in the aftermath of the Bush wars and the left feeling so beaten down, which is that, you know, you kind of never know how the seeds are going to sprout. and you can do your best. Like, you know, I feel like I've really been tending to the dead seeds and trying to build that into a force to be reckoned with. But like, you don't know in, you know, late November of 2011, like what Occupy is going to germinate.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many seeds that ultimately sprout. And you mentioned with labor, Fight for 15, and I can't draw the specific connections, but I imagine there was a huge impact in terms of laying the groundwork for the newly militant left-wing teachers union movement. And even during Occupy, which obviously wasn't labor organized or directed by any stretch, when labor did show up, it was really effective to stop Mayor Bloomberg's eviction attempt on October 14th, which I was present for, which was a success, the supposed cleaning of Zuccotti Park, which he backed down from, or to participate in Occupy mass protests. So labor was not at the lead of Occupy, but their connections were being made.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, also, could you just say what a shit thing that was for Bloomberg's whole refrain to be, I need to clean the park. I mean, it sort of played on the dirty hippie stereotypes.
Yeah, they're disgusting, these people.
Yeah, they're disgusting, these people. And yeah, you're right. Organized labor threw down and did these like mass text alerts and got people to go and defend Liberty Plaza or Liberty Square or whatever it was being called. The Transit Workers Union was another early and powerful ally. You know, I think those moments are really significant. I think I did, doing my research and remembering some of this period. Also, Mayor Bloomberg's girlfriend was on the board of Brookfield Properties.
I saw that. We're doing our reading as well. I was like, huh, I didn't remember that.
That was the thing. There was a lot of learning, to be done. I mean, so I think you're absolutely right. There were these connections formed with labor. There was also, a radicalization against the police. There was a lot of kind of naive, the police are part of the 99% messaging. I don't know if you remember, there was this hipster cop who became kind of iconic at Occupy.
He was like a plainclothes, Natalie dressed young hipster looking cop.
Right. I mean, but he was still a fucking cop,
Yep.
And these things became more apparent. I mean, the week of the mass arrests on the Brooklyn Bridge, when over 700 people were arrested, there was a donation of $4.6 million from Jamie Dimon. He needs to have that D on the end of his name.
Yeah, I know. I think that's what I thought his name was for a long time.
To the NYPD, and basically the sense of like, Wall Street and the NYPD are, working together and one on the same. And that I think, in no way can you take credit for the amazing work against the criminal punishment system and, police that's happening today. But I think it was really radicalizing for a lot of people who were part of Occupy, who had never had hostile encounters with the police before, to see just the wanton violence and the contempt that they were treated with. Yeah,
and it did kind of start, I think Occupy in a lot of complex ways did start to intersect with what were really BLM precursors around Troy Davis, who was executed in Georgia during Occupy's early days on September 21st, and then around Trayvon Martin's murder, which took place just a few months after Occupy started. And then, as you're saying, the NYPD had a major impact on the course of Occupy, and I feel like the repression mostly pretty much backfired, which is not to trivialize or romanticize what in some cases were pretty horrible costs of this repression, including a really serious injury suffered by the Iraq war vet Scott Olson in Oakland. But there was all of this repression, and though activists obviously and rightly decried police abuses at the time, it seems to me like it did more good for the movement by helping draw more attention to it than it did harm in terms of by taking people off the streets and putting them in jail. Because both the September 24th mass arrests and pepper spraying of activists, and then the October 1st march across the Brooklyn Bridge, which, as you mentioned, led to the NYPD making more than 700 arrests. These were both things that generated just like massive amounts of attention.
Yeah, it is true. I mean, Occupy was sort of catapulted into the mainstream media by these incidents and by these viral videos of police violence. I mean, there were some too that, we forget, but that were really major. So I remember this young activist, Megan Linick, and I actually had her write an account of it, filmed on her BlackBerry, so that dates this movement, as these NYU students were going to a Chase branch to close their accounts in protest. And the cops started basically dragging people from the sidewalk into the bank and beating them up and arresting them all when they were just going in there they weren't doing a sit-in. They were just saying, I'm against your role in the financial crisis. I'm closing my account, for which they were arrested and held for over 30 hours. And that video got over 1 million views. And that was novel at the time, right? To have these moments sort of be transmitted and circulated. A lot of that was anonymous, was amplifying these things, and they had such an enormous reach online. And I think, Occupy, what people had to get their minds around was that cops protect Capitol. I mean, that's who they are serving. They're protecting property, not people, and ultimately they're protecting profits. And that's actually something, that is a really core insight. And they were, there to smash heads when the time came. And I saw, a lot of people get thrashed, at my time at Occupy. And certainly it was happening. I think there were over 8,000 Occupy affiliated arrests around the country. And millions of dollars. I think Oakland paid out over 10 or $11 million of damages. So the public's paying for that too, right? We're paying for the violence that these forces are perpetrating. So yeah, there were these, again, that's sort of the teachable moment, right? Because it was definitely a shock to some people's systems to see this stuff.
We've been talking around this for a while, but Occupy, in terms of its legacy, it stood at the beginning of this cycle of social movements that would become and shape the left's resurgence. Chicago Teachers Union strike in 2012, Standing Rock in 2016, Black Lives Matter in 2014. Before that, as I mentioned before, these BLM precursors, and there was also particularly among Latino youth increasingly militant protest against the Obama administration's mass deportations, tied to a related struggle against Arizona's SB 1070 anti-immigrant law. And then came Bernie 2016, Bernie 2020, the most recent Black Lives Matter movement, the explosion of DSA beginning in 2016. And with Bernie and DSA, the connections are, for me, extremely clear. For me, it's impossible to imagine either taking off the way they did without Occupy. But more generally speaking, to what degree did Occupy create this new American left in all of its variety? And to what degree did it more mark the emergence of a newly emergent left that was fueled by a ton of different factors?
Yeah, I don't think you can say it created it. That gives Occupy too much credit. But it was the opening salvo, right? Like it helped inaugurate this new era. Again, it sort of foreshadowed what was to come. And I do think it contributed in some really direct ways. One is it brought back this kind of defiant protests, like, yeah, we don't care that there's no permit. We don't care if we're going to have to fight the police. Like we're going to have a more sort of militant ethos. It also, injected this class analysis that has been carried forward in these movements, right? I mean, even the protests against gun violence were highlighting the gun lobby and highlighting the profits of the weapons manufacturers and things like that. I mean, there are spaces where I know there are direct ties. I mean, you mentioned the murder of Trayvon Martin, and certainly, occupiers were directly connected with Dream Defenders, which is the amazing socialist racial justice group that emerged in Florida at the time. They occupied the Capitol. I believe Nalini Stamp, who I mentioned already as being really a key figure at Occupy, helped form that group, and there was, a kind of connections or influence there. But, again, it's not created. It's like social movements are these generative things, and we see people doing things and it inspires us to do them. And so there's this kind of free exchange that I think can't be reduced to causality, but it definitely helped kick off a social movement renaissance. And throughout it all, I have been like, when is this going to dry up? Like, when are we going to have another period like the aughts? And I'm really happy, that we haven't done that. Certainly I agree with you that you can see these direct links to Sanders, to DSA. Sanders, of course, then inspires AOC, inspires the squad. But there's also been an incredible resurgence of leftist candidates at the local level, and including a lot of occupiers who ran for office. So you mentioned Nikhil Saval, who is now a state senator in Pennsylvania. I always point to Jillian Johnson, who is basically the mayor of Durham, North Carolina. She was really prominent in Occupy Durham and Black Lives Matter. There is Sandy Nurse, one of them, who I just picture leading Occupy direct actions, who just want to, or is the presumed victor to win her primary, is heading to New York City Hall representing Brooklyn. I mean, so there's lots of examples of that. It would be interesting. I've never seen a full accounting, of occupiers who kind of basically, have gone on to occupy traditional politics and have done so in a way that addresses a lot of Occupy's concerns about co-option, right? And how did they do that? One, they're deeply connected to social movements, and two, they're funded by small dollar donations, right? Because Occupy was all about money in politics, Citizens United, and all that. And so, it also helped popularize. This is one point that Sandy Nurse, I think, is really clear on. That Occupy made these campaigns possible in a way by educating the public about kind of the political economy of elections. Like, if you don't fund it, you don't own it. If you don't fund it, they don't represent you, they represent their donors.
And so it's had this huge impact on the left, but also had an impact on politics more generally. It laid the groundwork for Bill de Blasio's Tale of Two Cities 2013 mayoral campaign, which obviously didn't turn out to be anything close to what everyone was hoping for, but it did play a big role in making inequality and kind of the inequality of the Bloomberg years, the NYPD enforced inequality of the Bloomberg years, the defining feature of New York politics. It was key in Elizabeth Warren's early rise, whatever came of that and whatever you think of what came of that. And it also arguably played a key role in laying the groundwork for Obama to stigmatize Mitt Romney's private equity background in the 2012 presidential election. So this is really something that just swept over American politics in its entirety.
You're right. It's easy to forget the Romney stuff. I do think that Occupy unwittingly aided Obama in that sense, because
ironically as well.
Because there were two comments that he made that kind of helped sink his ship. One, he very condescendingly told an audience that I think included occupiers from Occupy New Hampshire that corporations are people, my friend.
That's such a good line.
Which was completely just like out of touch with the vibe in that moment. And then he made his famous 47% remark, right? So Occupy's out there talking about the 99%, the 1%, and he says, well, there's the 47% who basically are the takers, leeching off the makers. And, that was the end of Mitt Romney. And
it was a private event, but it was a private event with service workers employed, one of whom decided to record it.
That is solidarity. I mean, what's interesting though is what did that show the Republican Party? Well, that they need to talk populist. So as a result of that, we're kind of in a more dangerous moment, right? Because Trump, as I said, he was totally happy to have these jumbotrons denouncing hedge funds, and just saying all sorts of bullshit. Well, ultimately, hating on the 47% and representing the 1%. I mean, so politics, I guess, has just gotten all the more confused.
Returning to something we were talking about a little bit earlier, I'm not entirely sure why, but Occupy laid the groundwork for the rise of a new left in a way that the anti-globalization movement a decade prior to Occupy did not. In part, I think the anti-globalization movement was smothered by 9/11. That's pretty obvious. But I also think that it was protesting the emerging contradictions of neoliberalism at the height of neoliberal legitimacy and power in the 90s. So the mass support that movement and the Nader 2000 campaign, the mass support that those things could draw upon was ultimately relatively thin. But 2008 was this thorough indictment of neoliberalism, and it put the system into something much closer to a legitimacy crisis. Do you think that's what made the left so much stronger after Occupy? It's just, on some level, it's a question of before or after 2008?
Such an interesting question. I'm happy that you helped answer your question, because I think this is something we kind of have to ponder through. I mean, I am a materialist, so I think the objective conditions contribute to the state of the left. And so, things were hard for people in the late 90s and aughts, but compared to today, wages will buy you even less. People are more indebted. Housing values are even more inflated. Our politics is even more sort of paid for by the corporations, because we've seen these restrictions on campaign financing come off. We've seen more voter suppression. So I think, we're in a post 2008 reality, and people, on the one hand, people are responding to the times and to the crisis, the everyday crises of their lives. I do think it's just interesting you putting those two things together, because that was me at 19, watching the global justice movement in Nader. And I think on the one hand, as I said, the global justice movement, for me, it was hugely edifying and important because it got me thinking about finance and all of these things. But as I've said multiple times, it was distant. And if you wanted to root yourself in that movement, then it was go to a local direct action network training. It wasn't join DSA. So it had this, as critics have said, it was all about sort of summit hopping. So you go from one big protest to the next. It didn't have a lot.
Trying to repeat the miracle of Seattle, which could never quite happen again.
Right. And it couldn't happen for very obvious reasons. You couldn't shut down another ministerial meeting of the WTO or, the conferences being held by the IMF because they knew you were coming. You only get to surprise them once, and the cops just are more powerful. And the next round of the WTO meetings were held in Qatar. Sorry, you're not going to shut it down. It's just not going to happen. So yeah, people got stuck on this sort of repetition, and, it was theater, and it was kind of bad theater. And then the Nader campaign, people can debate that endlessly, but it was going for the gold without building the necessary bases and structures, right, that could sustain a left.
Yeah, it was going for that buzzer-winning shot from way behind the, I don't know what the middle of the basketball court is called, the middle of the court or whatever.
From the back of the court, from outside the building, it's just you don't, to me now, I'm just that is such hubris. You have to do the work of building institutions and infrastructure. You have to do the work of organizing. And also wow, so you're going to mobilize all these people and then just fizzle away, and there's nothing for them to be engaged in or involved in. It was one thing for Occupy to not have structures to onboard people into, because it was literally planned by 20 people, most of whom were 20 somethings. I don't hold them to task for that, but I don't know. So I guess, that period, even though that period was not as bleak as the aughts, the post 9/11 period that came after it, that's the left was not anything to write home about then, and I'm not, I just think, the left has to give people structures to engage with. That's why labor unions are so important. It's not just that they can challenge capital in this unique way, at the point of production or the point of service or whatever. It's they're also ways for people to be together, to understand themselves in a sustained fashion, to just seemed like the left wasn't thinking like that back then. I don't know. What do you remember? I was also a kid, so that was my take.
I was an even younger kid. I was in high school. Yeah, I feel like the height of neoliberal globalization was producing a ton of disaffection, both in terms of middle class kid ennui about feeling smothered by a panoply of corporate logos and branding, and feeling like that was snuffing out any kind of space for authentic living. Or on the other hand, if you were concerned about the environment, the way that corporate America seemed to be destroying it rapidly, or if you were a Midwestern former factory worker who had lost their job due to globalization and was militantly anti-NAFTA. So there were all these contradictions amongst different segments of the American public that were taking shape in the 1990s, but the contradictions weren't leading up to a truly earth-shaking legitimacy crisis for the system. The system was still dominant. The system still enjoyed widespread support and legitimacy. And after 2008, that was no longer the case.
I agree. But the legitimacy crisis that we're in is so dangerous because the left isn't strong enough to capture it. Right. Yeah. And this is, again, why I think Occupy was this warning, and the people who failed were the elites who were having a baby crisis of legitimacy and are now having, a full-blown adult case. I don't know. And it's because...
Be careful what sort of legitimacy crisis you wish for, because when the when this all started, it was immediately the Tea Party that moved first.
Right. They moved first, and but now how this crisis manifests is, a total conspiracism. I think we see it in the, conversation around COVID. We see this
vaccines, QAnon.
Yeah, QAnon. And this is why, I wrote in a piece that the suppression of the left is a literal fool's errand, right? Like if you suppress the left and there are no structures for people to participate constructively and to channel their discontent constructively, right? To learn about why it is that the powerful, aren't responding to them, or why it is that, they can't achieve the American dream, then it, without those spaces, then, you just end up with people going into these virtual wormholes and like coming out with these absolutely like toxic, racist, destructive interpretations. And that's where we are. And that's why, I think the left is on the whole better off than it was 10 years ago if we're doing our kind of looking back thing, but the culture as a whole is in a way more dangerous place.
One thing that we should talk about that I meant to get to earlier is that the movement was disproportionately college-educated people from middle-class backgrounds. And amongst the actual occupiers, often people under 30, pretty young. Many, though, were also underemployed or recently laid off or heavily indebted. It was, in short, disproportionately made up of the sort of downwardly mobile middle class that would later form the core of a revitalized DSA and the 2016 Sanders campaign. And so, unsurprisingly, there was plenty of criticism at the time and afterwards of the whiteness of Occupy, though by most accounts, the protest got way more diverse over time, and there's always an extent into which a certain emphasis on the disproportionate whiteness of something like Occupy, it really obscures the mix of people who were there and whose lives were changed by Occupy. I think it's clear, though, that Occupy's whiteness and the persistent disproportionate whiteness of different corners of the left is a problem. But the question is, if we're interested in solutions, what is the origin of that problem? Because I think this critique about representation is vitally important, but I also think these critiques are too often made in a moralistic rather than strategic way.
Definitely. There was, you referenced it, there's the sociological paper by Ruth Milkman and others that did a kind of data analysis and found, yes, the occupiers we met and studied, extrapolating from their commentary, are younger, downwardly mobile, indebted. Again, they're kind of a disappointed generation, or a generation that's being let down. That said, I do think the movement, diversified as it grew. And certainly when we talk about some of the issues at the camp, who was actually holding down the space and camping in the park at the end, these were not middle-class folks who were there. And different occupies had different class characteristics and makeups, which is not to say, it's not to say that the problems you're raising weren't problems. It's just that I think there is some nuance there, but certainly Occupy never reflected the 99%. This idea, that we are the 99% was always aspirational and wasn't reflected in the movement's demographic makeup. I don't know. I mean, it's a tough issue because, as you said, it's a problem that lives on the left in some corners of the left. I guess I have multiple thoughts. One is, well, I'd rather white people be organized than not in socialist movements. So, I think it's important to just say that. Like, I'd rather have white folks be joining DSA than gravitating to QAnon, which is something white folks seem to really like to do. So I just want to state that. The other thing is, I think when we talk about our movements being diverse, you mentioned that it was kind of moralistic. I think we have to think about it in strategic terms. And I mean that in two ways. We don't want diverse movements just to be nice. We want diverse movements because we need everybody to win, and that is it. Like, our survival is bound up with other people joining and us forming not just coalitions, but alliances, right? I mean, this is a strategic point. This isn't about us like looking good or something like that. This is like, we need this. The other is strategic, but it's strategic in another sense, which is if you're actually focused on economics and material issues, be it in debt like I am, be it housing, employment, and labor, what you will do is actually find that those issues are racialized, right? Like when we start following the chains of predatory finance, what we find is that, the people who are most buried in student debt, far from being the image of like the white MFA graduate who is just thought they could make a living writing poetry or something, actually Black women are the most burdened by student debt. And that it's Black students who are, defrauded by predatory colleges who hold these enormous debt burdens without gaining any of the benefits of education. So it's like, if you actually do the economic work, right? If you actually are doing politics that's not just, it's not just about feelings or sentiment or whatever, but it's actually like, okay, let's talk about material reality. Then if you're doing that, you have a strategic reason for diverse people to join and come together to fight for their shared liberation.
Yeah. In an essay, Michael Dawson wrote, quote, "The decline of progressive Black politics is apparent in the Occupy actions that have swept the country to protest economic injustice." And so there were historical dynamics at play within Black politics and civil society as well. And we could identify similar dynamics at play within a labor movement that had been under attack for decades, when we're trying to understand why is this particular demographic coming to the fore of social movement left in a disproportionate way at this moment. And it's precisely, as you said, why the moralistic critique so misses the mark that the moralistic critique often hits, is just setting off bouts of useless white middle class guilt. Instead, we need a strategic analysis, then, now, into the future, of who's in our movement, who's not, who needs to be, and how to make that happen.
Yeah. And to your point, I think I do want to say, I think it's really important not to erase all of the people of color who were not just participated in Occupy, but led it. Many. I've mentioned Sandy Nurse, I've mentioned Nalini, but that is like the tip of the iceberg. And I do feel like that's one aspect of that conversation that it kind of can obscure the participants and leaders. People didn't call themselves leaders at Occupy, but that's in effect what.
But they were.
Yeah, but that's in effect what they were. I think the thing is, we have to make our movements. This is sort of organizing more generally, but we have to make our movements worth people's while. I don't blame working class people, and I mean working class in the diverse sense, not like I'm not conjuring like, the working class white man, but, real working class people for thinking, why would I go to Zuccotti Park in those first few days and like sleep in this square? Like, what's that doing? I have kids to feed. I have a job or two, I'm trying to make ends meet. Like, it took a while for Occupy to prove that it like had the courage of its own convictions and it was having an impact. And then again, it started to attract more people and more support. And I think, we don't have to do that in our movements through, showing that we can hold a plaza, but we do it in the Debt Collective, for example, by saying, organize with us and we will try to keep two horizons in mind. One, the kind of seemingly utopian horizon of canceling or abolishing, as we like to say, abolishing all predatory debts and winning the public services we need. So getting rid of student loans, having free college, getting rid of medical debt, having universal healthcare for all. But there's a good chance that actually we will help you with your debt along the way. And by challenging and disputing debt you have in collections that, is probably where the creditors are probably breaking the law, or helping you find some creative legal strategy. In other words, there is a chance there will be a material benefit to you. We will also, help relieve the shame and stigma you feel around your indebtedness. So there will be a psychological benefit, and you will find that you are not alone, which is our, one of our slogans. So I think we have to, this is the strategic point. Like if we want our movements to be more diverse, like we have to, it's not just about making space for people. It's giving people strategies that respect the fact that they lead busy lives, and they probably want to join something that has a chance of having a material impact.
A question someone on Twitter wanted me to ask you: why should organizers study Occupy? What can we learn from it?
It's both for the mistakes that Occupy made. So it is a parable about the pitfalls of consensus processes and direct democracy and claims of leaderlessness, but also because it's a reminder that you don't know what's going to work. And so I think it has this sort of like both a warning and an inspiration, right? Like the things, Occupy was innately contradictory. Its strengths were also its weaknesses. So its openness made it chaotic and invited conflict, but it also made it welcoming and made all these people show up and made people bring their whole selves and their creativity. And so I think that is something that organizers need to, we need to keep that in mind. Like this is a kind of contradictory process. We can try not to like run headfirst into these pitfalls, just like do things that are definitely doomed to failure. But then also we need to keep that openness and that spark.
Lastly, you wrote on September 23rd, 2011, in N+1's Occupy Gazette, or Occupy Inspired Gazette, which I guess was the technical name, quote, "I find the lack of historical knowledge about past movements and effective strategies and tactics, and institutions to pass such wisdom down, so depressing. Each wave of kids reinvents the wheel, believes they've fashioned it for the first time, and then there it goes, off the rails. I hope a fraction of them go on to dig in for the long haul and build some sort of infrastructure so the next generation isn't repeating this pattern." There are, of course, the people radicalized by Bernie who quickly become self-described anti-electoral revolutionaries once Bernie loses. But generally speaking, do you think that the left today has indeed avoided repeating that pattern?
I do. I mean, I think compared to the time to when I wrote that, we have come a long way. I mean, it's to the question you just asked me about why we need to study Occupy. I mean, I do think, as I wrote there, it's really important that organizers study history, in part because it's just vital to see the way that people have, responded to the conditions not of their choosing. And, I think, right now there's probably a lot to be learned from studying the movement of the unemployed during the Great Depression and how it took a while for organized labor to realize that actually they had a vested interest in like organizing unemployed people. I think the welfare rights movement has so much to teach us at this moment, and part of why we study the past is not just to learn about the strategies that our comrades of yore used, but to learn about the reactions and the counter attacks and the ways those movements were sabotaged by corporate and political elites, so that we can better prepare for those things, because all of that is real too. But I definitely see that we've invented some wheels and we're kind of holding it together, and I think this is why I take, I'm so happy that institutions like DSA are flourishing. And I really hope people don't take them for granted, because it's easy to kind of not understand how precious something that you've just kind of joined or is, always been there actually is, right? And that's why I think it is important to remind people of what it was like during the aughts when we were like running away from the pseudo-socialist organizers with their newspapers, because these are the things that are going to help build a left that's, robust enough and actually can sustain itself over time, so we can fight the incredible entrenched power that we're up against. And so I think we've made progress, and that if I went back in time and described where we are today to the Astra who wrote that reflection, I'd feel that Occupy was worth it overall.
Well, Astra Taylor, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It was fun.
Astra Taylor is a regular guest host here on The Dig, a filmmaker, writer, and political organizer. She is co-founder of the Debt Collective, director of multiple documentaries, including What is Democracy, the author of books, including, most recently, Remake the World, Essays, Reflections, Rebellions. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the beginner who has learned a new language always translates it back into his mother tongue, but he assimilates the spirit of the new language and expresses himself freely in it only when he moves in it without recalling the old and when he forgets his native tongue. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis, music by Jeffrey Brodsky. The Dig is recorded at WBRU in Providence. Our communications coordinator is Tamuz Frankel. Our senior advisor is Thea Riofrancos. Check out our vast archives and freely available copies of The Dig newsletter at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes, please also leave us a nice review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really and truly does that is you telling your friends about the show, why you listen to it, why they should listen to it, etc. Please make propaganda for us. And please do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks a month is huge.